Hey, good morning, everybody. It's really good to see you. I need to tell you that it really hurts when Gary Grogan gets a bigger crowd than me. So I'm just going to have to get over the pain and push on through. But it's a real joy and privilege to be able to share this week with a friend of decades, Gary and Bonnie, the dearest of friends. As Gary was speaking last night and reminded us of his prayer team, I couldn't help but remember a remarkable experience that we had in their church a little while ago, maybe a few years ago now, it goes by. But some of you will know our story of how in 2002, our son was crossing an intersection in Concord, North Carolina, and he did not see a huge 60,000-pound truck traveling at 65 miles an hour coming up from his right-hand side, plowed into his vehicle. His vehicle almost disintegrated, pushed him 120 yards down the street, took out trees like this as though they were just grass, and then there was still enough energy. It was one of those huge, big garbage trucks with the forklift at the front, and there was still enough energy in it to flip over and come down on its side right on top of Jay's car. And he was, the miracles began right away. For some unknown reason, there was a first response crew parked literally at that intersection. And when they got to him, they listed him as a G3, those of you who work in emergency rooms, and that meant no breathing, no pulse, no visible sign of life. And they airlifted him to the Carolinas Medical Center, and the news got out around the world. Places we had preached and long since forgotten that we'd ever been there began to intercede and pray. And I remember the church at Stone Creek was amongst those that just led the charge profoundly. And Gary expressed his support for us in ways that we could never say thank you for. And if you know our story in remarkable and wonderful ways through some very, very deep and dark experiences over 6 weeks where Jay was comatose, he eventually went on to make a full recovery. And they told us he would never walk. Oh, they told us he would never live. And they told us that for 20 days straight. Every single day, almost the first bit of news we got every morning was, today's the day, he won't. And called our pastor, again, dear friend of both of ours, and sometimes the whole team would turn up to pray for us. And then after that, we were told, well, do not expect him to walk. He had lost pretty much all of his blood during the time of being transported. And in the first 12 hours, he had 42 units of blood, which in itself should have killed him. There was so much foreign material, plus plates and frozen plasma in large quantities. We knew that because we got the bill for it. It was $36,000 just for blood products alone. And then after they found that his toes could wiggle, they told us, well, don't ever expect him to read again. There's been too much severe brain damage, brain injury, and then he'll never study again. And within 9 months, he was back at university, and he graduated about 2 years later. So it was a wonderful story, and we knew that during all of that time, the church in Stone Creek was interceding. So when Gary says there's a team praying, I know, because we're the recipients of that. And we were invited to speak at Gary's church, and we were just making our way into the service, and perhaps one of the very people who you mentioned last night was introduced to us and expressed that she had been very much in prayer for our son. And I remember Carol probably went through her phone and held up this picture, and this lady almost fell over, fainted. She said, that's the boy I've been praying for. I've had his exact image in my head as I've been praying. And so, that not only did God burden her to pray, but in addition to that, gave her an exact image of our son's face to pray for all those times. So those were those little reassurances. God knows all about our lives. He knows everything that's going on. And I want to tell you, every day is a good day. When you live through some deep waters, you come out the other side. Every day is a good day. And so we're very grateful for our friendship, for Gary and Bonnie. Gary used to visit us in England from time to time. And there was just one condition. If Bonnie didn't come with him, he was not going to stay in our house. And so, thank you, Nathan. So the condition was if he wanted to visit us, he had to stay in the dorms. And that was a bad deal because then our students never got any sleep. And for the better bit of a week, they would be up until 2 or 3 in the morning, broke every rule, dressed up as Captain America, totally and absolutely disrupted our institution. Took us 6 months to put the pieces back together. And then for some unknown reason, I allowed him to come the next year and the next year. And so far, we've managed to keep it down to just one visit to Trinity. And the Lord helping us, we will keep it that way. But so I have no idea what was going through Winston's mind when he invited you here. But this is dangerous. But just want to remind him, I'm actually preaching Sunday service. I'm preaching the last service. So if he tries to get one up on me, I've got the last word, Gary, just letting you know. Isn't it fun to be alive and serving Jesus? The last 2 days, we've taken a fairly deep dive into one of the parables that I think is most applicable to our current situation, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Brilliantly, profoundly expressed by Jesus as he responded to the testing of perhaps the preeminent law professor in the law school of Jerusalem. These guys were serious about what they did. They were working on top of the shoulders of many generations of profound scholars, deep scholarliness, trying to understand the moral law and its application. And they went through multiple phases of trying to unpack it. And I've spent 2 days sharing that with you, the parable of Jesus regarding the Good Samaritan. Well, Luke, who, if you know anything about the writing of Luke, Luke wrote his gospel completely differently to the other 3. The first gospel that we have is almost certainly Mark's gospel. It's almost cryptic. It was though Mark realized something needed to get out there. Somebody needed to just write down things before they got lost in second-generation parables and stories and novels. And so he wrote this very sort of cryptic gospel, just got the words out. There's nothing flowery about Mark's gospel. He gets through in the first chapter what some other gospel writers take 3 chapters to write about. It was the first. And then, of course, John was writing very much for an Essene or a religious community. And so he concentrated very much on drawing the line between the Old Testament temple and that we are now the temple of God. And you get this Johannine concept of the restoration of the temple in the people of God. Wonderfully rich theology. Matthew was writing predominantly for people who were still locked very much into a Jewish mindset. But Luke was the scholar. We know that he was a medical doctor. And we know that he got a scholarship to write his gospel. It was a wonderful thing. He received a scholarship from a gentleman by the name of Theophilus, a wealthy individual. And I can imagine that the background was, I will give you a scholarship, but I want you to research your subject extremely well. And so Greek kind of study methods came into place. He had been trained in a Greek methodology, which is still the foundation for most of our contemporary higher education method. And so he decided that he would do thorough empirical work. He used an objective method of study. He stood outside the story, and he decided he would let those who had lived the story tell it, and he would write it down. And so he had the privilege, and we know this from the book of Acts, of being able to go to Jerusalem with Paul. And then while Paul was having all of his troubles in Jerusalem, Luke took off. And he got to spend some time with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and he met with the disciples. So he had first-hand account. Though he hadn't lived it, he had first-hand account. And so it's got that wonderful kind of objectivity to it. And he writes these remarkable stories that Jesus told. So Luke's gospel is a scholarly piece of work, as is the matching volume, which is the book of Acts. And so we often speak about Luke Acts as one continuous volume. In fact, Acts starts out, in my previous writings to you, O Theophilus, I wrote. So that's Luke, and he tells these stories with great accuracy, having gone through a Grecian method of empirical research. So I'm sure that he didn't record these parables just off the hearsay of one person. He said, Peter, I was speaking to John the other day, and he told me about this encounter with this legal expert and the story of the Samaritan. How do you recall it? And there might have been another little kind of nuance on it, but it was confirmed. And so that's how he wrote. And Luke's writings are incredibly trustworthy because of both the inspiration of God and the way in which he researched his subject. So that's why I started out with the parable of the Good Samaritan that we're all familiar with. Today, in as rapid a fashion as possible, we're going to slip over a couple of chapters. We're going to dive over chapter 14, get to chapter 15 of Luke, and then tomorrow we'll go back to 14. So this is a whole week in Luke's writings. And we don't only have one story in Luke chapter 15, but if some of you know what I'm referring to, there are three interrelated stories, three that are all building one upon another. Now, I don't have PowerPoints, and that's deliberate. I don't have graphics, and that's deliberate, because I know in a morning session, I've got to do something to make your brains work. And so I need you to kind of put on the video in your head, because I'm going to do some descriptions of the geography that's behind the story, and then hopefully you'll get some of the impression that's really going on from it. So you ready to imagine some things with me? Let me try and give you a picture. If you would imagine over here, we have a board and we have a picture. And right in the middle of the board is the Sea of Galilee, sometimes called Lake Gennesaret in the Bible, sometimes the Sea of Galilee. It was a predominant source of the economy of that region of the world. Fishing was a very big part. It was also used for transport from east to west. And if you know anything about the Sea of Galilee, they sometimes call it a heart-shaped sea. It does look a little bit like a human heart. It's fed out of the northern waters that come out of what is today Lebanon, where the hills are actually high enough to get a little bit of snow in the winter. The snow melts, it comes on down, it fills the Sea of Galilee with beautiful, clean water. And by the way, for the first time in over 50 years, this year, the Sea of Galilee has reached its original water level. It's been emptying out over the years because of the huge demands of growing populations in that part of the world. And then, of course, that beautiful, clean, fresh water from the mountains that melt and come down, they go through a region called Dan, and Dan is sometimes called Dan Jordan, Jordan, you get the connection there, and that was the tribal area that was committed, but it's also the headwaters of the Jordan River. So you've got Lebanon up here somewhere, and a few high hills, Mount Hebron and others, and then you've got this river running down, and it comes into the Sea of Galilee. Getting a bit of a picture, and the Sea of Galilee is kind of this oblong, heart-shaped sea, and then, of course, the River Jordan exits in the southern part of it, and that's where you start to get to the places where John the Baptist did his stuff, and we go down the Jordan Valley that cuts down into the deepest point on planet Earth that's land. It's not the deepest part of the ocean, of course, but the deepest place, which is down into the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is part of a great rift system. The great tectonic plates of the world started to separate, and it goes all the way down from the Mount of Olives through the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, down through the Red Sea, into the Nile River, all the way down the Nile River, and then you get the Great Lakes of Africa, all part of the same rift system, deep, deep valleys, deep, deep lakes, comes all the way down the eastern side of Africa. You get the plains on one side in Tanzania, and you eventually come down into the mountain ranges of South Africa, all of the same geographic feature that runs all the way down through the Jordan Valley, across the sort of upheaval of the Mount of Olives, and then through the Dead Sea, and then out Red Sea, which is a gulf, and then the River Nile, and all the way down. So I'm giving you a big geography lesson, but just I'm trying to get those gray cells going. So let's get back to the Sea of Galilee. You with me? And if you imagine the Sea of Galilee, this heart-shaped sea, right at the northern point was a city called Caesarea. It's where Peter came from. And in fact, his mother-in-law was healed there. And it was a city named after the Caesar. It had been an ancient Hebrew settlement. And then during the time of Herod, it had been built up. Herod built all kinds of obnoxious temples over in Dan, and then he built some larger buildings near Caesarea. And to try and keep in the good books of the Caesar, he named it Caesarea. He got rid of the old Hebrew roots, and you had Caesarea of the Galilee. And it was right at the top. And Caesarea was quite a grand town, probably the grandest town in the Galilee at the time. And so they built a large synagogue, and they built it in a Grecian style. So you immediately start to picture the 4 or 5 columns, Grecian columns, like you get in Greek temples. And there was the synagogue. And then there were, as was customary at the time, a whole load of stairs that went down from the synagogue. And by the way, this has all got nothing to do with what I'm going to say, but I just thought I'd get you started. And so you get these stairs going down, and then you'd hit the main street. So please help me. Is your imagination doing okay? Do I need to tell you how it smelt and what the leaves looked like and what sort of things were planted? I'm just trying to give you the big picture. And then you get Main Street, which was actually lined with a range of fairly grand buildings. You can still go and see the ruins of those buildings to this day. They would have been places of commerce and and all kinds of shops and very important places. And then you would get closer to the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and you would get to probably the busiest crossroads in the whole area. I mean, it's like Main Street and 281 in Ellendale. That's how big a deal these crossroads were. If they we don't have any traffic lights in Ellendale anymore, but it was a real main intersection. So if you can imagine, you've got traffic coming around the eastern shore of Galilee, coming up to the north, and then so that was the eastern shore was the area called Decapolis. Just trying to help you. That's where Decapolis, place of 10 cities. That's where all the pigs ran off into the sea after the man was delivered. You do know these stories, I hope. If you don't know, they're in the Bible. But and so the traffic would come up, they'd come around, and then it would go around the northern shore and down to the next big center, which was Nazareth on the western shore of Galilee. And so you had this really busy crossroads because this road that went around the northern part of the Galilee would cross there. So you've got Main Street, Caesarea. You've got this main highway that joined the eastern to the western shores of the Galilee. And then it continued going, and it continued going out onto a wharf, a jetty, that went right out, probably, it's estimated, about 70 feet into the Sea of Galilee. Did you know that they already had concrete in those days? It's remarkable. In fact, Caesarea on the west coast, not to be confused with Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea on the west coast was one of the largest harbors in the Mediterranean at the time, and it was all built with concrete. And anybody who knows anything about concrete can harden underwater. And so they built this huge harbor that still is there to this day, built about the same time. So just trivia. Won't do you any good, but if you get slightly blessed, I'm okay. And so then you get this wharf where the major industry was, of course, shipping or fishing. And so they would come in their boats, And they've discovered some of these boats. In fact, very close to modern Caesarea is an ancient boat exactly of the time of Jesus that they discovered in the mud, and they rescued it, and now you can go and visit that boat. And they would come in and they would buy and sell. So it was a hub. It was the economic hub of the region, Caesarea, up the northern part of Galilee. Have you got that picture? Road going around the top, big synagogue, main road, coming down, intersection, going out into the sea, ships coming up or boats coming up, buying and selling, money flying in all directions. Well, it was right there, and I've spent much too much time, I'm sorry, but it was right there that a very shrewd individual by the name of Levi got active. And he set up his tax booth. I mean, what a brilliant place. I guess he paid a lot of people off and had a few bumped off along the way. It was the Galilee mob that he belonged to. And so he set up his tax booth so that the second anybody did any kind of buying or trading or selling, right on that crossroads, he was able to cream off the tax. Really brilliantly done. And he made a lot of money. He had the biggest house in town. It wasn't on the right side of the railway tracks, but it was the biggest house in town. And Matthew, who he became, Levi, was a very wealthy and influential man. He had obviously got a lot of power, and he had the colonial overlords on his side because he was doing them a favor by collecting all of this tax. And one day, Jesus, who was just in the early stages of calling his disciples into his ministry team, happened to go over to this bench where Matthew was. And Matthew was pretty rich, but he had a whole lot of internal problems. He struggled with his identity. He had national identity issues. He felt like a sellout, but it was still lucrative to do that. He was not at all popular in town. He had many people who hated him, but he still creamed off all the money. He was making a ton of money. Jesus walks over to him and he says, Matthew, I want you to join my ministry team. And we read that in the Bible and say, well, that was brilliant. What a good thing. It was radical. It was crazy silly. For Jesus to do that, it would kind of be like Ethan going up to somebody in Fargo who's doing drugs outside the high school. You know how we feel about those people who sell drugs outside the main gate of the high school. And we wish we could catch them all and sort them out behind the barn one day. And we don't like those people, right? Who just ruin the future of our kids, get them addicted by the time they're 15 years old. And it would be kind of like a pastor in Fargo going up to somebody at the high school and saying, hey, buddy, I see you get on really well with teenagers. You seem to have something in common. You get in on. I was wondering whether you would become my youth pastor. I mean, try and translate that. That's how radical Jesus' calling of Matthew was. Matthew was overwhelmed. It was the first time in his adult life that he had ever been affirmed at all. And it was just such an awesome moment that this great rabbi had called him that he literally shut up shop. I don't know what he did with the chattels and the income, but he left it, and he was so overwhelmed that he said to Jesus, Jesus, this is the most amazing moment of my life. Those of you who remember those dramatic conversion experiences of your life. And he said, I've never, ever had anybody affirm me like this. Please, please, Jesus, will you come to my house for dinner? And Jesus, of course, accepted the invitation. So he goes down to the part of town where good people and respectable people didn't used to go. He goes into this huge big house. And of course, the only company that Matthew's able to attract are all the seedy people of town. And so sinners and prostitutes are present. And Jesus goes into this house, which by anybody's standards would have contaminated them religiously. And even the disciples go down, but they just, no way are they going into this house. They're not going to taint their reputation. So they stand outside. Jesus is inside, having a really good time with all of these people, sharing with them the good news of the kingdom. Matthew's life is dramatically transformed. He's radiant. Everything about following Jesus has come to pass in his life. And Jesus, in the midst of having this good time, turns around and says, "Where are the boys? They haven't come in. What's wrong with them?" So he excuses himself from, I'm embellishing it a little bit, but it kind of happened this way. And he excuses himself and he walks outside, and there the disciples, but the disciples aren't alone. The disciples, for the first time since they had become followers of Jesus, are actually ganging up with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees saying, "What's going on with your rabbi?" And Peter, in a way that Peter would only say, "We have no idea. It looks like he's lost his marbles this time." They didn't know anything about reverence in those days. And so the Pharisees saying, "But he's in there with tax collectors and sinners." "Yeah, we know," says another disciple. "Just don't know what's going on. We are more awkward than you'll ever know." And so the Pharisees and the disciples are kind of in cahoots outside Matthew's house. And Jesus walks out and says, "What's going on?" They all suddenly straighten up and try to, pretend that they haven't been saying anything bad about Jesus behind his back. And Jesus stares them out, and Peter drops his head. And he says, "You don't understand, do you? You don't understand what's going on inside this house. I'm in there with Matthew, who's just come to the light, who's a follower of mine. I'm in there with people who really need..." No, says the Pharisees. No, says the disciples. "We really don't understand, Jesus." Jesus says, "You don't understand? Are you that dumb? Don't understand?" No, we don't understand. "Those are not nice people, Jesus. You spend another hour in there, they're going to wreck you. They're not good. They're a bad influence. They've been a ruin to our town." Jesus says, "Really?" And then Jesus does what Jesus does best. He says, "Because you're so dull, I'll tell you a story." And I told you the other day, when Jesus says, "I'm going to tell you a story," sit up, take note. It's going to be a challenge. So he starts the story. He says, there was a farmer, you know it, don't you? It's all Luke 15. Won't read it, I'll just tell it. It says there was a farmer who had 100 sheep. And like a good shepherd, he had them out all day in the fields, and then they used to bring them into a stone enclosure, and they would always count them in. I had an uncle who was a sheep farmer, and I've never seen anybody like it. When they were loading up to go to market, they'd be piling over each other. They would be running in all over the place. He never got it wrong. He could count them no matter how fast they loaded, those sheep running on. He'd always get it right. And I remember him telling me that a sheep is a very Christian animal. It's always ready to die for no reason whatsoever. It'd be fine one afternoon, go out in the field, the next afternoon it's dead. There's no reason why it's died. But so I learned a little bit from my uncle, who was a sheep farmer. So the shepherd comes in and he's counting them. And he goes through them all, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And he gets to 90, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. And one's gone. He says there was one missing. And I can imagine a Pharisee over there saying, "So what? Happens all the time. Sheep take off sometimes. If you haven't learned before now, Jesus, sheep are pretty dumb animals. And sometimes they just die, and sometimes a wild animal will get them. So every single farmer in the world knows that there's going to be a certain amount of attrition. Things go wrong. Things break down. Animals die. In fact, every businessman in the world knows that. They know, Jesus, that right at the important time of making a delivery, the wheel goes flat, or the engine fails, or something goes rotten on the shelves, or a delivery doesn't come in on time. There's no businessman in the world who does not make some provision. It's called contingency funds. Jesus, we all know that. We wouldn't be Pharisees if we didn't have that kind of business sense. So, one lost sheep, give us a break, Jesus. And Jesus, with piercing eyes, as he is, I hope, today, looks down on that motley collection of disciples and Pharisees, with the noise of the party of Matthew's conversion still going on behind him, and says, that's the problem. And he goes further and says, you will never understand me. You will never fully understand my mission and call. You will never get a full understanding until you know that I am committed to the lost one. Everything about me will be misrepresented. Everything about me will not be well shared. Your understanding of my call and mission will never, ever be complete until you understand my primary call is not for the 99 fat found sheep, but it's for the one that's lost. It's for those that need me. My friends, in this Bible hour, can I suggest to you that we too have an immense danger of having a warped picture of the Jesus that we worship if we are not moved by the fact that he's committed to the lost one. I was a very young pastor, and 3 or 4 young people came off the street one night, and before the service was over, they were sitting right here in our church, about the same size as this, and I knew they got dramatically saved. I mean, their countenance changed. It was a wonderful experience. I said, great job, guys. Do you think we could fill the next 3 out next Sunday? Well, they took the challenge. So they hadn't been in church long enough to resist those sort of happy challenges. And so they did. And 2 more became Christ followers. Within 3 months, we had 60 teenagers who were all Christ followers, had been Christ followers within that period of time. They were the best. They loved every sermon. They thought everything was great. They worshipped. And they filled this row out, and then most dramatically and scary of all, we got to the 3rd row. And right here, these 2 seats, they dislodged 2 of our dear, long-serving saints. It was bad. They had sat there for 32 years. And they came to church at the normal time, and their seats were gone. Well, I was kind of enjoying the moment, but I tried to pretend not. I'm a young pastor. I want to try and keep the peace. Brother Barker, he's in heaven now, so I can tell you any story I like about Brother Barker. Brother Barker comes storming down. He worked for the Electricity Supply Commission, and he was our treasurer. And in earshot of these 2 people, he stands, and this is before a Sunday service. How silly some of our older saints can be. And he looks in my face. He says, just want to remind you, brother. You know, in those days, we didn't have first names. And he said, just want to remind you, brother, these young people don't tithe. I said, oh, they don't tithe. One day they will. And I said, I'd rather have them worshiping Jesus and finding faith and making an impact in their homes and schools than have a fat, found sheep grumbling over being dislodged just 1 seat back. We eventually got some of those 8 rows back. And I counted up the other day, at least 16 of those young people are in ministry today, 40 years later. They didn't tithe for a while, but they were the lost. Friends, you will have a warped picture of Jesus until you understand his massive commitment to the lost. And the disciples and the Pharisees are going, huh? And they didn't get it. Jesus looks at them and says, you don't get it. No, Jesus. Just don't quite understand. He says, I'll tell you another story. Oh, this is dangerous now. Another story. So he says, there was a young lady who lost a coin. Well, we read that in our English Bible, say, well, that's pretty tough. Coins aren't worth very much anymore. But it wasn't that case at all. If you didn't know what happened, these coins, some of them were minted in the time of King David. They certainly had a high gold content, or at least valuable metal content, and they became part of the family dowry. These were really important coins, and they were passed on normally through the maternal line, from grandmother to mother to daughter, and so on. So it was likely that this coin that Jesus was referring to had been in the family between 12 and 14 generations. So you can just imagine the sentimental value that's tied up. And in fact, they became so important, these coins, over the generations, that the sort of successful branches of the family would collect them. And then on the wedding day, which was always a really big event in the Jewish social life, they actually would embroider these coins into a headband. And it could be 4, 5 coins and embroidered into the headband. And then the dad would take his beautiful daughter aside, and he would say, like most dads say, that boy is not nearly good enough for you. We've got our grandkids here, but I'm telling you what, their dad did not deserve our daughter. Apart from anything, he's German. Schwartz. How could an Alexander marry a Schwartz? But so, of course, he took his, the dad would take the daughter aside and say, that is the most fortunate young man in the whole of the Galilee. And I want you to walk with your head held high as you come into whatever it was. I don't know if they had a procession or how they did, but certainly the bride would make an entrance. And I just need you to go past his family. And while they're sitting there all smug that they're getting you into their family, I want you just to give your head a little shake and show them the coins. That's what the dad would say. Show them, because we need to remind them just how fortunate they are that they're getting you. And by the way, us as well. So what's changed, hey folks? Those kind of things still happen in family life today. And the girl loses one of those coins. Do you get a sense now of how desperate she must have felt? This is part of their heritage. This is a really big part of their family's collection. Probably represents some of their family wealth. So what does she do? You know the story. It says that she started to sweep into the corners. She was just such a girl. I don't know how it is with some of you, and ladies, you could probably tune out for the next few moments, but I find it really difficult to find things that aren't lost. I married a wonderful girl, and she's done my laundry for 44 years. And she comes and she puts all my socks in a drawer. And I go looking, and there is no way in all the world that sock is in that drawer, that pair of socks. So I think to myself, I'm not going to be embarrassed again. I am going to find that sock. I said, I've been in the army, so I tell you what, let me establish a grid pattern. And I get this kind of grid pattern going, all the way across from left to right, and then all the way down, and I go through it, A1, A2, A3, I go all the way down the grid. Not there. So 10 minutes later, and feeling desperate, I say, Carol, I have no idea how this, it's sorcery. She walks into the room, opens the drawer, reaches in and pulls it out. It's ridiculous. And it still happens. It's called domestic blindness. It's a very well diagnosed disease. So guys are normally pretty useless at finding things. But girls, unbelievable. I don't know, they find it without even looking. But this girl looked. She swept into the corners. She went down. She went to where she last thought she had it. She established a system. And as you'd expect, a good girl, she finds the coin. And there's great rejoicing. Jesus says, so it is in the kingdom. When a lost one is found, there's great rejoicing. Now, we already know about how we worship Jesus because he loves lost people. I've already established that, I hope. But here's the point. Lost people have to be found. You see, you can't open your Bible app and stick it on a park bench and think that somehow in the next 6 or 8 hours, somebody's going to get saved. Because the Word of God is, we can sometimes get very spooky about the Word of God, you know. We worship Jesus and then we obey his word. We don't worship the word, we obey the word. And so lost things are found when people look for them. And I'm not being nasty, friends, but I get to travel a whole lot, and I meet pastors who in the last 10 years have not looked for one lost soul. They've spent no effort searching and praying and longing and worshiping Jesus as the lover of lost people. And almost everyone who does not look for lost souls has multiple complaints about the place that God's put them. It's just true. They don't like the people, they don't like the church, they certainly don't like the secretary of the church. They get on the phone to the superintendent. Well, there's some benefits of getting a little older. And I'm glad that the president's position isn't up for vote at district council. So if everything's a grumble and a complaint, try, find a lost person. I guarantee an arm around a shoulder at the gas station and somebody saying, I have been searching so long, you have no idea, this encounter has just got to be God. And you lead somebody to Jesus, your town will look beautiful. And church will look wonderful on Sunday morning again. But you've got to find lost things. And finding lost things is effort, commitment, and a desire to get out there and do it. Looks at the disciples and the Pharisees, says, do you get it? And they say, still not really, Jesus. Just listen to that party going back there. How can anybody love those people? Jesus says, you don't get it. I'll tell you a story. And we've got about 3 minutes. I'm going to tell you a story that you've heard many times. Maybe in a way you haven't heard it. Young man in a completely anti-cultural position comes to his dad, says, Dad, I don't like you. His dad says, sorry, what can I do? He says, cut me my portion. Everything inside a good Pharisee's mind was raging at that point. They were saying, send the Pharisaical police and bring him in. Because that is anarchy. That'll start to invade our society. If he gets away with it, other young people will get away with it. And before long, we've got problems and rebellion and issues going on in our society. We've got to squash this before it gets very far. No defunding the police force here. But Jesus lets the story roll. And surprisingly, the father, who goes on to amaze these Pharisees in several occasions, says, that's okay. We'll divide up the assets. And the younger son would have got at least 1/3, because the intention was to keep the land together. So the older would inherit 2/3, the younger 1/3. And that's how the farms would stay together. Well, it was probably a pretty sizable amount by the rest of the story, and the boy goes off, and the Bible very, in a sanitized way, says he squandered it all on riotous living. And you could see the Pharisees. This is really getting them. The lost coin, that's one thing. The lost sheep, that's not. But now this is just a totally anti-cultural possession. This is annoying beyond words. This young man needs to be sorted out. The father's been irresponsible. And Jesus can see that they're getting really hot under the collar and getting worked up. And so the young man gets to the end of all of his money, and Jesus looks at them, and I think he got a little twinkle in his eye, and he says, guess what, guys? He got a job on a pig farm. For a Pharisee, that was about as bad as it got. And he could see the Pharisees were steaming, so he thought, I'll just put the knife in and give it one more twist. At least that's what I think Jesus probably thought it in a nicer way. But, and he says, and he had to eat pig's food. And the Pharisees, this is now really getting to these Pharisees. Anti-cultural, rebellious, anarchist, squandering, everything that was antithetical to a Pharisaical worldview. And if that wasn't enough, the young man comes to his senses and decides to go home. And the Pharisees saying, good job. He's going to get flogged when he gets through the door. So that's what they would have done. And Jesus starts to dramatize the story, and they're heading home. And to the surprise of the Pharisees, he says, the old dad is on the porch, looking out for his son. Pharisees thinking, wouldn't be me. I wouldn't be looking out. I'd have the big stick, maybe. And there in the distance is a little speck. And everything inside the dad's heart gets stirred and moved. And he stands up just a little bit. He says, could it be? Maybe. I've looked out day after day. It hasn't been. Could it be today? Could it be that my son's coming home? The speck grows a little bit larger, and there seems to be something recognizable, and the dad thinks, just could it be? And when it gets just a little bit closer, the dad becomes persuaded this is his son who was lost. In fact, they had a ceremonial funeral for the boy, which is what Jewish families would have done. Taken the last of the things that he left behind, burnt them all, and put them in a grave, and said, this son of mine is no more, he's dead. I will not even bring him into my memory. And this father was defying every single one of those social values at the time. The Pharisees are going crazy because they like to keep every last little bit of the law. And they're getting agitated. And Jesus is building it up. And he says the father reaches down between his knees. He grabs the back end of his cloak and he pulls it up between his knees. No self-respecting gentleman would do something like that. And then to add insult to injury, he not only pulls that robe up between his knees, but he starts to walk, and then his legs are disobeying him. They start to go faster than he ever thought they could. And he breaks into a trot. And it's his boy. And he sees his son still smelling of the pig pen. And he throws his arms around him and he kisses him, making himself in that moment ceremonially unclean. But who cares? And in his ecstasy of his boy coming home, he looks around and suddenly every window in the house, there are people staring out of it. And he shouts up the road, "Get the cloak," which was reserved for special guests with whom they would cut a really good financial deal, by the way. And every head in every window goes like, "Not the cloak." And the father stands tall and asserts his authority. "You get the cloak. And while you're about it, bring the sandals. And hey, you, in my room is the ring. Bring that too." Somebody go out and kill the fatted calf, because the son of mine who is dead is alive again. And we're going to party. Because Jesus loves lost and broken and hurting humanity. My time's gone, so let me say it as simply as I can. And so should we. It's been so wonderful worshiping again after 90 days in public without being able to just turn it off to run to the restroom. You've all done that, haven't you? But I want to tell you, friends, as vibrantly as we worship Jesus with some of these beautiful songs, if you don't love lost people, Jesus will be a warped image inside of your worship. And so I commend to you the stories of Jesus. He loves lost people, and so should we. Stand, and I'll dismiss you. Thanks for listening to me so well. Tomorrow we'll go back into the previous chapter. I'll give you some kind of historical background again. Got a geography lesson today. You'll get a history lesson tomorrow. And if it's boring, don't come. But what a privilege. Thank you for the privilege of being with you this week. It's a huge privilege. Dee Dee's back there if you want to pick up one of Carol's books, and we'll be around. And then Friday, Carol's going to speak to us. And so that'll be a little different, and you'll all go home and say Friday was by far the best. But let me pray. Jesus, I thank you for people who are prepared to listen through to the full implications of your word. And how easily we can relate to some of these stories and find ourselves actually on the wrong side of Jesus' story. So I pray for my friends today that a big part of being on this camp will be that we'll get onto the right side and we will enjoy the company of sinners and lost people and win them to you. So bless us through the remainder of our day, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks again, everyone. God bless you.